Should one race in order to live, or live to race?
La Régie Renault a choisi la Formule 1 pour deux raisons. La première, c'est son niveau technique très élevé. Et ceci impliquait un niveau d'exigence considérable. La deuxième, c'est sa notoriété mondiale et le fait que Renault soit une marque mondiale avec des ambitions mondiales et avait besoin de trouver un objectif de compétition qui est une expression internationale et une diffusion internationale.
Well, I've always enjoyed motor racing. When I was a child at school, I found it a fascinating subject, and it really dominated everything I thought about when I was young. That terrific enthusiasm pushed me into racing, supported me throughout all the difficult times, and even today, when we're quite successful, it's still as strong as ever. There's no doubt about that. It's just something from within.
There seems little in common between the reasons why a major automobile manufacturer and a small specialist team go racing. For a long time they coexisted or raced against one another. But these days, it's not uncommon to see them associated with one another to form the ideal combination. In the early days of the car, the reasons why a manufacturer should go racing was scarcely any different to current reasonings. Quite simply, racing was a way for those manufacturers involved to prove to their clients the qualities of their products, for the cars that they raced were virtually identical to those which they sold. In the 20s, however, the technology of Grand Prix racing needed to be more specialized, and so bigger manufacturers such as Peugeot, Fiat, even Mercedes, moved away from racing, allowing specialist sports car manufacturers to take the stage. This then was the great age of Delage, Alfa Romeo and Bugatti, who found that racing not only enhanced their corporate image, but also fed the bank balance, as they were able to sell racing cars to wealthy gentlemen drivers. And until the end of the 60s, Grand Prix cars were painted in their national colours, British racing green, Italian red and French blue. This suggested that Grand Prix weren't simply contests between manufacturers and teams, but also between great industrial nations. In the quest for status and propaganda, the leaders of the Third Reich soon appreciated the prestige to be gained from winning with German technology, flying the flag which denoted the increasing power of Nazism. So, at the beginning of the 30s, they began to encourage their major motor manufacturers to enter Grand Prix racing as it was then. But it wasn't enough just to participate. It was imperative to win, and even, if possible, to totally dominate their rivals. Consequently, Mercedes and Auto Union were largely used to prepare for battle. The two major German manufacturers were tempted by large subsidies and launched their campaign with a standard of equipment unknown until then, and results weren't long in coming. Faced by this formidable armada, better organized and extremely well equipped, the opposition of Italian and French specialist manufacturers crumbled. Just as quickly and efficiently, a few years later, the same nations would come up against similar opposition of a much more ferocious nature. Unfortunately, all this could be seen in hindsight, but few of the nation's leaders could actually see the nature of the threat so obviously demonstrated by their future enemy. In the meantime, the Silver Arrows won all the great races between 34 and 39, perfectly fulfilling the role and succeeding in the mission which the Nazis had assigned them. In the eyes of the world, they represented and symbolized the efficiency of the regime that promoted them. The idea of motorsport as an instrument of propaganda had just begun. Today, thankfully, there are no examples of Formula One being used to such ends. Nevertheless, the very expensive subsidy which Fiat has paid to Ferrari since the late 60s is motivated by similar considerations and with similar reasoning. Fiat is exceptional in that it owns almost all the major Italian car manufacturers, but the directors see Ferrari as flying the flag for Italian national industry as a whole. So each Ferrari victory is seen as being a selling aid, not only for Fiat's, Lancias or Alfa Romeos, but also for machine tools, washing machines, and a host of other products of engineering. Besides, Ferrari have never changed their traditional national colours. In the 50s, motor racing in Britain gave rise to a whole new generation of specialist Formula One car builders, some of which would dominate Grand Prix over the next 3 decades. But it was the rich industrialist, Tony van der Velde, manufacturer of the famous bearings of the same name, who would be the first to attempt to win the World Championship. To drive his Van Walls in their attempts to beat the Ferraris and Maseratis, he hired the best of the English drivers, Stirling Moss, who was, with Fangio, the best driver in the world at the time. The campaign nearly worked. Van Wall won the Constructors' Cup in 1958, but Moss just failed to win the title, which went, in spite of fewer wins, to Ferrari driver Mike Hawthorn. At the same time, with the support of British Steel and with the aim of promoting British industry as a whole, British Racing Motors, or BRM, was created, which, after an extremely hesitant start, slowly began to establish itself as a #1 team, led at one time by the talented Frenchman Jean Berrat. When van der Velde closed down his team due to ill health, BRM took up the challenge and reached its peak in 1962, when Graham Hill and the team won their respective world championships. The 60s were the golden age of BRM, but sadly they went into slow and irresistible decline in the 70s. But the team ran many great drivers in its time, Jackie Stewart for instance, but also the great Mexican driver Pedro Rodriguez, the superb Swiss driver Joe Siffert, and even Austria's Niki Lauda at the start of his career. And Jean-Pierre Beltoise won for the first and only time at Monaco in 1972. It would also be BRM's last. But the end of the 60s saw a new structure in place in Formula One. The association between a major industrial company who would shoulder the greater investment, the engine, and a specialist manufacturer who would build and run the cars.
Colin needed a new engine. We had impressed him suitably, and he thought that I was likely to be able to design him a suitable Formula One engine, so he tried to get some money to support the venture, and I'd been bold enough to say I thought that we could make a Formula One engine for £100,000. And we went to see a few people, and then Ford took immediate interest and agreed to pay us the money to make a Formula One engine.
I think that's really great. I think that this is the first time we've been able to coordinate the build of an engine and a chassis together and design each one to suit the other. And with the sort of weight and simplicity and power that keeps coming up, I think we're going to have a fabulous motor car.
Yes, I quite agree. Very reasonable. I would say that was about 50,000.
Walter Hayes was a public relations director with great foresight. He could envisage the huge profit that Ford could make out of its Formula One involvement. Thanks to him, Ford invested a relatively small sum of money and gained an enormous amount of prestige and publicity by participating in just such an operation. In structural terms, the Lotus 49 was innovative because the engine was a stressed member, a structural part of the chassis which carried the rear suspension. This was something that would later be universally adopted on all Formula One cars. Its V8 engine was designed and developed in the workshops of Cosworth, a small English engineering company which until then specialised in building competition engines based on small capacity production blocks. It would therefore have seemed risky to have thrown them suddenly into the deep end. But that's where Hayes and Chapman were clever, correctly assessing their potential and having confidence in them. They would be paid back more times than they could ever have hoped for. Two Lotus Fords made their debuts on June the 2nd, 1967 at the Dutch Grand Prix, and it was sensational. After Graham Hill dominated practice, Jim Clark won the race ahead of Brabhams and Ferraris. It would be the first in an extraordinary series of more than 150 wins for the V8 Ford Cosworth, which would establish a record unprecedented in the history of motorsport. But the use of this engine would not remain the exclusive right of Team Lotus, and gradually it would take over as a power unit for the majority of the field, to the point where, but for Ferrari, Formula One might quite simply have become Formula Ford. Obviously, the entire structure of Formula One had been transformed. There was no longer need to invest huge sums in the manufacture of an engine. All a team had to do was to buy a Ford Cosworth to be sure of being powered by a competitive engine. The era of what Enzo Ferrari disdainfully called the assemblatori, the kit car manufacturers, had begun.
We seem to manage to beat them all with, first of all, Lotus, and then the Matra came out and with Jackie Stewart driving, and then McLaren, and we gradually got most of the good teams, and therefore we won most of the races.
Between 1968 and 1982, 15 years, the V8 Ford Cosworth DFV won titles for no less than 12 world champions. Stewart, Rindt, Fittipaldi, Hunt, Andretti, Jones and Rosberg all owed their titles to that power unit. And it would win its 154th and final victory in the United States East Grand Prix in Alboretos, Tyrrell, after 16 seasons of great and loyal service, an incredible record of staying power. This success story marked a break in the pattern of the history of Formula One. In spite of occasional Ferrari success, it now appeared that the task of making a complete Formula One car had become a handicap for a team, as was illustrated by Matra's experience. When he entered Formula One, Matra boss Jean-Luc Lagardère quite sensibly opted for a two-pronged approach. On the one hand, he supplied the Tyrrell team with chassis into which they fitted the ubiquitous Ford Cosworth V8. But at the same time, he set up a 100% Matra team, whose cars were powered by their own superb V12. On paper, this engine had more potential than its rivals, because its basic design meant that it should have been able to rev higher and thus give more power. But on the minus side, it was a lot thirstier, and worst of all, a lot more complicated. Consequently, it took longer to develop, particularly as the team was a lot less experienced than its British counterpart. Built with the aid of a government subsidy, the V12 Matra certainly made a nice noise. Unfortunately, however, the French manufacturer chose to divide its efforts between endurance racing and Formula One, which did nothing to help the results in either. So, while the Matra Ford flew from success to success and took Jackie Stewart to the first of his 3 world titles in 1969, the Matra went from one setback to another and would never win a single Grand Prix. In fact, it wasn't until 1977 that the V12 won, and then it was fitted into the back of a Ligier, driven to victory in Sweden by Jacques Lafitte. Even though Renault's programme was run very differently, that team's experiences were in many ways similar. The Régie came into Formula One in 1977 to promote its image.
Nous pensions que la première preuve que nous devions faire, c'est de montrer que Renault faisait de la compétition et accédait progressivement au niveau de notoriété mondiale avec cette compétition, mais en même temps, elle voulait développer une technologie de pointe qui pouvait avoir des retombées sur l'image technique de Renault et éventuellement sur des produits de série futurs.
Years earlier, Mercedes, relying on its industrial and financial power, only had to beat a number of small Italian teams who did little more than tease the industrial giant. By throwing all its resources behind its campaign, Renault hoped to have the same success. But times had changed. The advent of sponsorship had changed the game. Since the 60s, the smaller teams had become wealthier now that they could tap into outside finance. That had raised the overall standard of competition, and the smaller teams had become much more professional and better equipped than they had been a decade earlier. They were therefore much tougher and tenacious adversaries, and Renault also chose the more difficult course of action by deciding to construct and run cars entirely designed and built by their own engineers and technicians.
Je crois qu'il aurait fallu désolidariser plus vite l'équipe de course de Renault pour qu'elle soit plus indépendante et plus souple. Si j'avais à refaire, c'est maintenant, je dirais peut-être en 81 ou 82, fallait-il déjà couper le cordon ombilical qu'il y avait avec les motoristes, qui faisait que l'ensemble de l'équipe moteur plus châssis était peut-être plus lourde à manier qu'une équipe anglaise.
Between 1977 and 1985, the Renault Sport team won 15 races, but never achieved their chosen goal, the World Championship title. Honda tried to do the same thing, but with no more World Championship success in the 60s, winning just the 1965 Mexican Grand Prix. But having learned this lesson, the Japanese manufacturer then enlisted the help of Lola and Surtees as partners. However, this was no more successful and was soon curtailed. Nevertheless, Honda had been able to weigh up the advantages and disadvantages, so that when they returned to Formula One in 1983, it was simply as engine suppliers with an ambitious V6 turbo initially supplied to Spirit, which were virtually their test team.
Turbocharged engine is anyway the advanced technology for the future in the passenger cars. So we are not intending to come into the racing just as for winning, but also we want to develop the new engine technologies as a controlling system of the engine, especially for the fuel injection. It is digitally computerized, and it's a sensor, basically RPM, and also the pressure boost of the engine is the basic sensing factors.
Honda's approach set new standards in that they drew on all the major elements from their factories and seemed not to have a budget. Even so, the Japanese also appreciated that they needed to enlist the help of a major and successful partner. Within 6 months, they had teamed up with Williams, the previous year's world champions. Their main rivals were the McLaren team, whose cars were fitted with tag engines developed by Porsche, and Brabham, who had BMW power and for whom Nelson Piquet would win the 1983 World Championship. The Brazilian moved to Williams and would win the title again in '87, this time powered by a Honda engine. But the Japanese were unimpressed by the rather public inter-team rivalry between Piquet and Mansell, and were wooed away from Williams by Ron Dennis, whose McLaren team was setting unprecedented new standards in Formula One professionalism. Once again, this partnership was one between a large automobile manufacturer and a small specialized team concentrating solely on Formula One. But the McLaren team was no longer what the French had once referred to as a garagiste. McLaren was now a highly professional team with very tight organization which left nothing to chance, whose perfectionism, presentation and preparation surpassed anything previously seen, helped in no small way by a sizable budget courtesy of sponsors. What Ron Dennis had done was to set his sights higher than perhaps anyone before. He wanted to totally dominate the sport with faultless reliability, reaping total success. He found the budget and in so doing established new standards for his competitors to aim at. In the meantime, this battle plan, allied to Japanese stringency, would carry all before it. Into this perfect mix, Dennis added the best two drivers he could find, Alain Prost, the champion of the 80s, and the only man perhaps capable of beating him on a regular basis, Ayrton Senna. Dennis's battle plan almost succeeded. Without Honda engines, the Williams team were almost and also ran, allowing the McLaren pair to share 15 victories from a possible 16. Only the Italian Grand Prix was missing from their record, allowing Ferrari a face-saving victory. Honda, with McLaren, would win the 89, 90 and 91 championships, giving them a full house total of 6 constructors' titles in 6 years and 5 drivers' titles. Only Ford and Ferrari had more victories, but over a much longer period of time. Between 86 and 91, Honda's engine dominated Formula One, almost without rival. But by the time the Japanese manufacturer decided to quit Formula One during the 92 season, they had found a worthy rival.
Ce matin, nous avons terminé la négociation et avons signé avec Williams un accord de partenariat valable sur 3 ans, 89, 90, 91, où nous fournirons les moteurs à l'équipe Williams.
Renault had pulled out of Formula One at the end of 86, having failed to win the world title and suffering a period of financial difficulty. Now they had returned as an engine supplier to the team who had first taken Honda to victory. Frank Williams and Patrick Head still led the team. Patrick Faure, the boss of Renault Sport, was less demanding than Ron Dennis had been. He wanted victories in 90 and to be a World Championship contender in 91. Bernard Dudot's Renault engine team had spent its 2 sabbatical years usefully, taking advantage of the time and change in regulations to design a V10 like Honda's. The new rivalry of Franco-British team versus Anglo-Japanese had the scent of a Europe versus Japan confrontation. Frank Williams' team, however, still didn't have the strength of Ron Dennis's McLaren. It would take 2 years to rival them. But Renault's engine was immediately promising, and they had found an associate of a caliber that was missing during their previous efforts with the turbo. A team that was very experienced, could react quickly, and was totally independent, allowing it to exploit its partners' effective means without the burdens of a large enterprise. In order to beat McLaren Honda, both Williams and Renault quickly realized that they would have to take engineering risks so that their rivals' weak point became their conservatism. To begin with, this proved costly until they became reliable, and then they began to pay off. It was Mansell's attack on Senna at Barcelona in 1991 that symbolized the changeover, signaling the end of McLaren Honda's reign and the advent of Williams Renault. Even so, Mansell, in spite of winning 5 races, was still unable to prevent Senna winning the title. But the program was underway, and he would succeed in 92 when Mansell, Williams and Renault would win their titles.
Thanks, guys.
Where Renault had failed in their turbo era, and where Scuderia Ferrari also failed, was that they did not have the partnership enjoyed by McLaren and Honda, Williams and Renault. They illustrated that after 80 years of Grand Prix racing, the battle between major manufacturers and specialized teams was a draw. They had to work together to be successful. That way, it was possible to draw the maximum amount of knowledge and enthusiasm from the former to begin with, but also the great financial power from the latter, who could invest much more heavily. At the beginning of the 90s, there was no other way of attaining technical perfection in Formula One. Both methods of tackling the same job had had their day, and the ideal solution was a combination of the two. No other sport has changed more in the 85 years that Grand Prix have been run than the world of motor racing. This is perhaps due to the interest represented, the costs that it engenders, and the inherent dangers. But more than any of those, it is because the sport is more intricately allied to technical progress than any other, and that demands adaptation and many other restrictions. Until the end of the 60s, however, the development of cars, circuits, rules and procedures simply took their own rather haphazard course. Under the aegises of an easy-going governing body, the powerful organisers of Grand Prix did their own thing as they wished. In fact, they made sure that the importance of their individual races virtually eclipsed that of the championship, and they ensured that their own importance was such that they were able to work exclusively to their own ends. The result was that only the cars made progress, while each individual organiser, jealous of his own patch, remained an individual. The competitors, however prestigious, simply had to accept their lot and improvise where necessary. However, from the start of the 70s, the circuit organisers were brought more and more into line as the increasingly professional competitors pushed the International Federation to implement strict common regulations. Now, each of the 16 Grand Prix that make up the Formula One World Championship is run to a rigid schedule, and the governing body ensures that it is strictly adhered to. The timetable, the order of practice sessions and race day schedule, scrutineering, press conferences, the allocation of pits, accreditation, and even the position of motorhomes in the paddock are all pre-arranged and are identical from race to race throughout the season. So now there is no need nor room for improvisation. Each team, even before it leaves home for a race, knows what to expect. Apart from trips to overseas races, cars and equipment are taken to races by magnificent, purpose-built transporters rivaling one another in prestige and power. Basically, the race has already begun. The aim is to be in position and operational from the Thursday afternoon before a Grand Prix, ready for the first practice sessions, which will generally take place on the Friday. Once in position, the frail Formula One cars are unloaded to be placed in their garages. Generally speaking, there are 3 cars available for 2 drivers, one being the spare or T car, T for training, and the drivers having 1 each. The rest of the truck is filled up with several tons of wheels, engines, spare parts, tools, and pit equipment. The spares are closely monitored, as every part on the car has a limited life, and in order to ensure the driver's safety, parts are changed at regular intervals. The drivers often arrive in their own private aeroplanes. Olivier Grouillard, the French driver who was with Ligier in 1989, is going to act as our guide through a Grand Prix weekend. He will reveal some of the secrets of the pits and take us through doors normally closed to the media to give us the driver's eye view of the weekend's events. It's Friday morning. Practice is due to start shortly, and the procedure will be the same on Saturday. After many years of 90 minutes, starting at 10, the morning session was cut to 45 minutes, starting at 9:45 in 1993. As many as 30 cars can go out on the circuit at one time, but there is a maximum of 26 starters per Grand Prix. Any more than 30 entries results in a pre-qualifying session opening the weekend's events.
Il faut donc, en 2 fois 1 heure et demie, arriver à déterminer et des réglages de qualification pour avoir la meilleure place sur la grille de départ, et des réglages de course pour que votre voiture soit le mieux adaptée pendant la course, avec les pneus courses et avec le maximum d'essence dans la voiture.
The morning sessions do not count towards the driver's grid position. They are simply for setting up the car for the driver.
On ne vous demande pas d'être au maximum de la voiture et il est préférable de bien se concentrer sur les réactions et sur le comportement de votre voiture pour bien arriver et à l'analyser et à donner le maximum d'informations à l'ingénieur et à l'équipe pour modifier la voiture et la rendre plus performante.
Il y a un truc qui ne va pas, Richard. Il faut qu'on se dépêche à trouver ce que c'est ou alors on saute sur la voiture. Le seul truc qu'on peut y avoir, c'est les pressions qui sont 10 fois trop hautes par rapport à ce qu'on avait fait la dernière fois. Le temps n'est pas le même, etc. De notre information, quand je freine, je suis en survirage, c'est-à-dire je pars comme si, hop, de suite à décrocher de l'arrière. Ça me donne l'impression qu'on a beaucoup déroulé sur l'avant, parce que tu regardes, les 180, 160. Je refais deux tours, mais avec beaucoup moins de pression. Un 250 et un 150 à l'arrière, pour voir si ça vient de là.
The understanding and relationship which a driver has with his engineer, who is responsible for setting up his car, is one of the most important factors regarding a driver's performance in motorsport. The driver has to describe accurately how his car is behaving and its reaction to changes. The engineer has to analyze the information that he receives in order to eliminate the faults and to work out the best solution. To do this, there is a whole range of elements that can be changed, and changed quickly. Formula One cars are specifically built so that this can happen. It's essential because not only do circuits themselves change from one to another, but track conditions at the same circuit can change. It's repetitive, detailed work, but essential not only to a car's grid position, but to its performance in the race itself. The parameters are more numerous when it comes to the engine, but electronics have replaced the driver in providing information for the engineers. They have readouts and monitors with which to oversee, analyze, and if necessary, modify their super sophisticated and powerful machines. While the cars are out on the circuit, microprocessors on the engines record and transmit information to the pits, where the engine technicians can simultaneously follow everything that is going on in their engines, for lap after lap. And once the morning's session is over, engineers and technicians, plus the drivers, meet behind closed doors in the team's motorhome.
Le but du briefing, bien entendu, c'est de faire une synthèse de la séance d'essai qui vient de se dérouler. Il faut avoir une démarche très rationnelle. La première des choses à faire, c'est par exemple les gros problèmes. Si vous avez un problème moteur, est-ce qu'il faut le changer, est-ce qu'il ne faut pas le changer? Si vous avez un problème de frein, si vous avez un problème d'embrayage par exemple, s'il y a des grosses modifications à faire sur la voiture, il faut le dire très vite, faire un choix très rapidement pour que les mécaniciens puissent changer telle ou telle pièce sur la voiture. Après, c'est un dialogue avec l'ingénieur pour savoir le choix de pneus que l'on va faire pour les qualifications ou pour la course. Et là aussi, il faut aller assez vite aussi, parce que vous n'avez plus le droit de changer 30 minutes avant la séance de qualification.
Between the sessions, there is a hive of activity in the paddock around the tyre suppliers. The morning's tyres have to be stripped off and new tyres mounted for qualifying in the afternoon. What are the various different demands on tyres?
The problem here is speed. We're not going for distance. If we wanted to go for distance, we wouldn't go as fast, we'd go much longer. So speed is a whole criteria for qualifying. And the faster you make it, the less long it's going to go.
The super sticky, short-lived qualifiers are no longer used, but race tyres are best in their first few laps. What's the difference between qualifiers and race tyres?
Basically, the construction is the same as a racing tire, but the compound is much, much softer. It's intended to get hot very fast, grip very good, and not necessary to last very long. All you want is heat and grip for a very short period of time.
Before changes in 1993, each driver was able to use just 8 tyres per hour-long qualifying section. Marshals and officials checked each car as it went out to ensure that it was using tyres within that allocation. The limitation of tyres is an attempt to iron out the advantages of the wealthier teams able to buy many more sets than the less well-off teams. But it also means that tyre companies don't have to bring the more than 3,000 tyres they already have to transport to circuits. Once mounted on their rims, the tyres are placed in small ovens or the tyre covers that keep them warm once they are mounted on the cars themselves prior to the driver going out onto the circuit. It's 1 o'clock in the afternoon. This is the most intense part of the weekend, apart from the start of the race itself. Qualifying on Friday and Saturday was 1 hour. Now it's 45 minutes, and in that time, drivers must try and set the best times for one lap that they can. The timing for all Grand Prix was originally established by Longines and Olivetti, although Tag Heuer recently succeeded Longines.
Aujourd'hui, le chronométrage est entièrement électronique. Nous avons 3 systèmes différents. Le premier système, c'est l'identification par un émetteur qui est monté sur une voiture, et au moment où la voiture passe la ligne d'arrivée, il y a un signal qui est donné directement dans la cabine de chronométrage. Au même endroit, il y a encore une photocellule qui prend par le coupure de la lumière. Ça donne aussi un signal dans la cabine. Ça, c'est le deuxième système. Il y a un troisième système. Ça, c'est le système vidéo. Nous avons créé une caméra qui filme le point de l'arrivée avec 100 images par seconde. Et on a donné à chaque image une impulsion de temps. C'est-à-dire, nous pouvons, avec ça, prouver un temps.
It's a short, sharp competition. Drivers on the line for a matter of a couple of minutes. No room for error, everything to play for. The times appear as they happen on timing monitors linked directly to the control tower, giving an immediacy to the whole operation. Without doubt, the master of the art is Ayrton Senna, the out-and-out record holder for the number of pole positions. No one else but he has so successfully managed to combine intense concentration, total determination, utter commitment, and risk-taking. Ayrton Senna is a phenomenon in qualifying, a demon. When he's on the track, all his rivals hold their breath as they anxiously follow him around the circuit. He is the standard against whom everyone else is judged. All eyes are upon him. After a relatively slow warm-up lap to bring in his tyres to the correct working temperature and condition, Ayrton flies, wringing from the tyres, his car, its engine and himself the very last ounce of performance as he practices his art. Another pole position. Once more, Senna has won the race against the clock. But like every other driver, however, he is subject to the same checks and scrutiny by officials. Here, the car is being weighed to ensure that it doesn't weigh less than the minimum imposed by the regulations. Should it do so, Senna's time could be disallowed. But Senna and his team don't need to cheat to be quickest. For the media, then, the story will be the same. Senna on pole again will be flashed around the world by the army of journalists, which covers motor racing in numbers only rivaled by the Olympic Games and the Football World Cup. Saturday evening, the battle for pole has been rough and has left its mark. Neither the bodywork on the cars, battered by curbs, nor the hard-working engines pushed to their limits have been spared. Even then, not all drivers will have qualified for the race. The slowest will have been excluded. But the engines and gearboxes of the 26 drivers who have qualified will be checked and very often changed for the race itself. Thus begins a long evening for the unsung heroes of Grand Prix racing, the mechanics, who will fastidiously check every component and element of their machines. It's race day, the culmination of everyone's efforts. Wise spectators arrive early on Sunday morning so as not to miss the half-hour warm-up session. This has no influence on the grid order, for that is already settled. But it allows the drivers to run their cars in race conditions rather than in qualifying trim, and there's a big difference. Now race distance is taken into account. Instead of being almost empty, fuel tanks are brim full to their 200-litre capacity. Wheels are now fitted with hard tyres whose efficiency will last much longer. The engines are adjusted to improve fuel consumption. Aerodynamics are changed. For those further back, the aerodynamic load is eased to facilitate overtaking rather than to give maximum grip under braking and in corners. The warm-up is the final opportunity to test for race conditions. But there's only half an hour available. Even so, in that time, a hierarchy emerges that some believe is much more representative of race form than the time set in qualifying. They suggest that brilliant qualifiers aren't necessarily the best strategists.
Take up your correct starting position. I will give
During the morning, the drivers and their team managers are called to a briefing by the governing body. There's a studious atmosphere. Here they are reminded of the principal procedures to come, late changes to the regulations. There are questions, answers. There's advice and warnings from the president of the federation, whose English, unintentionally, offsets the serious tone of the proceedings.
And all the drivers in the world are looking after you in the TV because they think stupidly that you are an example.
Discipline and fair play seem to be the message, meted out by the president of the governing body and the clerk of the course. Suitably berated, the little class of the world's best drivers disperses, each driver going off to concentrate on the race to come, sitting quietly, working out last-minute points in the 2 hours before the race. It will be physically tiring, so that many, such as three-time world champion Nelson Piquet, have a massage in order to prepare themselves for the rigors to come.
La première contrainte, c'est la variation brusque de vitesse. La variation brusque de vitesse, elle se produit dans les virages pris à prise rapide. Il y a aussi les décélérations et les accélérations qui sont des variations brusques de vitesse et qui soumettent le corps à des contraintes énormes. Donc il faut que le muscle du cou en particulier réagisse. Et puis vous savez, tourner un volant de Formule 1, c'est pas les leviers de vitesse, c'est pas des boîtes automatiques, du moins pas tout le monde malheureusement. Et ça demande des bras, beaucoup d'efforts. Oui. En plus de l'effort musculaire, il y a l'effort cérébral. Le cerveau est un organe qui lui-même est un très grand consommateur d'oxygène et de sucre. Et ça, il ne faut pas l'oublier. Et la tension soutenue pendant 1h30 est grande consommatrice d'énergie.
Baladier is also a specialist in diets.
Petit à petit, on s'est aperçu que bien se nourrir, c'était important. Et dans tous les sports de haut niveau, maintenant, on fait attention à ce qu'on mange, à ce qu'on boit. Et c'est tout à fait naturel, on est fait de ce qu'on mange. Hein. Alors, les jours de course, il faut amener les substances nécessaires. Donc, c'est classique, c'est-à-dire ce sont des sucres lents, ça va être à base de pâtes et de fruits, de salade de fruits, quoi.
Others have less rigorous preparations. Journalists, like VIPs, look after the inner man prior to the afternoon's labours. Spectators feast their eyes on the focal points of the weekend as the cars receive last-minute attention. There are many attractions, almost sideshows, as the Grand Prix draws near. But tension is mounting. 10 minutes before the pits are open, drivers like gladiators march to their pits to find their cars. The pits are open for 15 minutes. All the cars must now come out onto the grid. During this time, they can do as many laps as they like, the very last laps, to test for any uncertainties. The level of concentration mounts again. Waiting in the heat, in Brazil, for example, is another burden for a driver and his car. Fuel tanks are protected. Dry ice cools the radiators. Patrese uses a refrigerated skull cap to keep a cool head. Drink bottles are fitted to cars to combat dehydration. A driver can lose between 3 and 4 kilos during a race. Some drivers use neck straps to hold their heads upright in corners where they may be subjected to 4G or more. But now the driver is alone as the countdown begins. The field will do one more parade lap, which will bring them back to the starting grid. They bring their tyres up to temperature. The cacophony produced by 26 hybrid engines no longer worries the drivers. They are completely isolated from the outside world. They hear nothing, see nothing. Their concentration is at its peak as doubt and fear raise pulse rates. This is the moment of truth. The first few laps are the most dangerous. Wheels are inches from one another as the drivers defend their positions or attempt to overtake. A car laden with 200 litres of fuel is hard to control. It is now that most of the incidents occur. Accidents rarely allow a driver time to be frightened, but they often mean an early end to the day. In the pits, however, the car's progress is eagerly and anxiously followed by the team. He should be here by now. What happened to him? Ah, there he is. That wasn't him. Hope and disappointment are just two of the emotions felt in constant and quick succession, with accompanying powerlessness, even uselessness. Now everything is down to the driver. Little can be done in the pits. It was different during the turbo era of the 80s. Refueling was then permitted during a Grand Prix so that team members shouldered considerable responsibility, equal to the amount of danger. An error not only threatened a car's participation, but its driver's safety. Now, pit stops increasingly revolve around the necessity for new tyres. It's a less dangerous exercise and promotes a race within a race. The best teams can change 4 wheels in under 5 seconds, thanks to air hammers, intensive training, and meticulous organisation. Grand Prix are held over a distance of around 300 kilometres, and they last around 90 minutes, depending on the circuit. It demands an incredible mental effort on behalf of the driver. No other sport involving speed and risk demands such long periods of total concentration. The body, too, suffers, particularly as progress in the properties of materials used in tyres and aerodynamics now mean that drivers can be subjected to 5G. Consequently, drivers have to be real athletes. "16 times a year, motor racing's traditional checkered flag greets the hero of the day. Winning a Grand Prix is not the privilege of many. Between 1950 and 1990, 40 years, just 68 drivers have shared victory in the 500 Grand Prix run in that time. It's a sport that is so hard fought that even those who finish in the top 6 and score World Championship points regard their feat as a minor victory. But while the last glorious act of the day's play is being enacted, the scenery is being taken down elsewhere. With Grand Prix taking place every 2 weeks, there is scarcely a moment to lose for either winners or also-rans in getting the cars back to their factories and preparing for the next race. It's partially thanks to this frenetic calendar, not counting private testing, that teams comprise as many as 200 people. Now begins another race, that of getting back to France, Britain or Italy, the 3 main countries involved in Formula One.
Saga.